I am Jimbo Paris, and you are listening to The Jimbo Paris Show. All right. Hello, everyone. I am Jimbo Paris. Welcome again to The Jimbo Paris Show. Today we have a very special guest. His name is Jeff Rasley. Rasley. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize if I'm not. He is the author of 14 different books. He's published hundreds of academic articles. He's been on over 150, close to about that, different podcasts. And again, I've been researching him a lot. This is a very successful person. And he's basically all across YouTube. And he even has an internship that's named after himself. So let's sit down and kind of speak to him. This seems like a very interesting individual.
Namaste, Jimbo.
Great to meet you. Hey. Yeah. Wow. So, how have you been?
Well, I just came off a pickleball court after playing a couple hours of pickleball. And we have a third creature here. My little cat is wandering around. So she may pop her head in now and then, but she's quiet. She won't have anything to say.
All
How are
right,
you?
excellent. Yeah, I'm doing great. And I'll be doing even better now that I'm doing this interview with you.
Well, thanks. Thanks a lot for having me.
My pleasure. So, first of all, let's kind of get into you. What is your profession?
I was a lawyer for 30 years, and about the last 15 of those 30, I was the head of a small law firm. So I, not only handled cases, I was the primary manager of the firm. But I've always written. While I was practicing law, I mostly wrote articles. But as my law practice wound down and then I retired from the law, I devoted myself more and more to writing books. And so that's how I've managed to have 14 published, most of them in the last 10 years since I managed to escape the law.
Okay. And what was the journey like?
Well, the journey into law was interesting in that I was really interested in just learning everything I possibly could about everything under the sun after I got into my mid-teenage years. And so I did things like I hitchhiked across the country. I did a motorcycle trip with a friend all the way through North America, way down into Mexico. I spent a summer studying in half a summer studying in Europe, and then hitchhiked around Europe. And then finally kind of got serious about just focusing my education on the actual academic side, and graduated from the University of Chicago College, then went to law school. And I really wanted to do impactful social justice type work in law. And so for the first few years, I worked for an organization called Legal Services Organization, and we did poverty law cases and social justice cases. The two that were the most important to me were that I worked on. We forced two different counties in Indiana to build new jails because their jails were over 100 years old and the conditions were really horrible. And then I decided I really wanted to start making money. So I went into private practice with a big corporate firm, learned the business side of law, and then struck out with two of my best friends from that firm, and we started our own firm and had, you know, good success over the years.
So tell me about your first ever published book.
Okay. It was called Bringing Progress to Paradise, What I Got from Giving to a Himalayan Mountain Village. And what the book tells my story of getting into Himalayan mountain climbing, which I did in my early 40s, and transitioning from just using the Himalayas as a wonderful place for adventures to becoming a serious philanthropist and starting a foundation over in a remote area in Nepal, which I'm still the president of, and working to develop basic infrastructure for this remote area. It's called Basa, and the foundation is called the Basa Village Foundation. And when I first went to Basa in 2008, there was no running water, no electricity, no vehicles with wheels, no roads, no internet, no radios, no TV. But they did have a little village school with 3 grades, and they asked me if I could raise or donate $5,000. That would be enough money to buy the materials to add a fourth and a fifth grade to their school and to pay 2 teacher salaries for 3 years. So I mean, I was really kind of amazed that such a small amount of money could do so much because there are 85 kids in the school. So to give 85 kids 2 more years of education, pay 2 teachers' salaries for 3 years, and add to a building. Anyway, so I agreed to do it, and then I just sort of fell in love with this village. The people there were just wonderful, and they're so tough because they live such hard lives, but also so sweet and kind. And so I turned that initial project eventually into this foundation, and we've done electricity, water, computers, another school building, a medical clinic, sort of all the basic infrastructure that people need for just kind of the basic quality of life in the modern world. Um, but what we wanted to be very careful about was to try not to change the local culture, because they have a really beautiful culture, and we didn't want to impact that in any negative way. And so that's been it's been a very interesting experiment to see if you could bring these modern, um, quality of life services to a village that was basically has been living the same way for 500 years. So it's an ongoing experiment, and the latest project that we actually just approved is to develop an agricultural project, which will involve raising goats and pigs, um, because the village doesn't really have a sustainable economy. All of the villagers are just subsistence farmers, so they grow what they eat what they grow. If there's a bad weather season, it's very dangerous. And the only real work that pays money for these Himalayan villages is for the men to hire on to expedition companies. And because of COVID, the last few years, trekking and mountaineering tourism went way down in Nepal. So all those guys lost their jobs. And back a few years before that, they had terrible earthquakes, and tourism died for another year and a half. So we're going to work on developing this project to create a sustainable business for the village to, bring in regular revenue.
So, why did you become president?
President of the foundation,
Yeah.
because I started it when the villagers asked me to, raise this money for their school. I just I did it by asking other friends who were trekkers and climbers who had some connection with Nepal if they'd like to contribute to it. And and at first, I thought, well, that it'd just be a one-off thing. But after I visited the village, and then they said, well, you look across this huge valley and we can see lights over there. And we know these other villages have electricity and they have lights. And the teachers in the school said, we would really love to be able to study at night. But, it's very difficult to do that without electricity. And so, how about raising money to build a little hydroelectric system here? So I said, yeah, okay. And so that led to the creation of the foundation, because that was going to involve more money and more people, and we needed the expertise of an engineer, and so that's how it came about.
Hmm.
And I was the group I put together. I was elected as president.
So, what inspired you to become a writer?
I grew up um, in a family of journalists. My mom and step grandfather and stepfather were all editors of our local paper, and so I was around writers growing up, and then I married my wife was a writer and an English professor, and she had her first novel published when she was just 21 years old, long before my first book was published. um, and so it's just been something I've been around all my life. And I, as a teenager, started just wanting to express myself, wrote some poetry, most of which was pretty bad, but eventually developed some skill in writing poetry and had a few poems published when I was in college. And then transitioned into writing articles. I wrote articles for legal journals, and then because I've always loved and done a lot of traveling, wrote a number of articles about adventure travel and finding, meaning beyond. I didn't want to write articles like, oh, this is a nice hotel and this is a great restaurant. That writing like that never appealed to me. But so I would, what I thought was an interesting travel experience, and then think about, well, what did I really get out of this? What did I get out of it beyond just, oh, it was fun? But experiencing a different culture, meeting people who were very different from me, and so those were I wrote a lot of articles like that, and then eventually, um, in my very last year of practicing law, had the time to work on that book about my experience in Nepal and Basa.
How long does it take you to write a book?
6 months to a year.
Hmm.
So if it's something that I really, you know, I really know what I want to say from the very beginning, it's about a 6 month process. And if it's one that I have an idea, but it isn't fully developed and it has to develop as I'm writing it, then it's more like a year.
I find that interesting because you do look like a guy who likes to take his time with these types of things.
Yeah, and some of the books I've written, I there were reasons that I had, at least kind of a deadline, and I felt rushed somewhat, and I never I didn't like that. I didn't feel good about it, um, and so to be able to just take as much time and rewrite. I mean, I'll do a first draft and then I'll edit it and then I'll rewrite it. I mean, it gets, rewritten a bunch of times, and how many times just really depends. It's different. It varies from book to book, but that's really the part that I enjoy most. And I've heard a lot of other writers say this, and my wife says the very same thing. What we enjoy in the writing experience the most is the working over a manuscript where we've already got at least a first draft, and trying to improve it. um, that's that's really, at least for me, where the real joy comes. That first draft is usually, it's hard work. It's a struggle. It's, what am I really trying to say, and how can I say it in a way that readers will relate to and appreciate. But then once that first draft is done, then it's just, okay, now I got it. Now how do I make it better? And then rewrite. How do I make that better? And anyway, I wish I could always just have a first draft done, because that's the hard part.
When did you first consider yourself a writer?
Well, I would say, while I was practicing law, and I had a number of articles published. I thought of myself as, in terms of, professional job, career, primarily a lawyer. I mean, that was how I spent most of my working time, and writing was an avocation. But I thought of it, as more than just a hobby. Um, and because I wanted to be serious about it, but I couldn't spend all that much time on it because I had a law firm to run, and I was raising with my wife. We had two boys, and I wanted to be a really involved father. So, I spent a lot of time doing that. And then I had a bunch of other obligations, serving on boards and coaching sports teams and playing on sports teams. And so, writing in terms of actual time was a small piece of my life during those years, but it was a very important piece to me. And so I really, looked forward to the time when I would be able to devote more and more of my time to it. And after I left the law firm, and it was sort of like, life has really opened up, and I still had, other obligations, like being the president of the Basa Foundation, and I've been a board member on some other nonprofit organizations, and so I've always, done sort of, that philanthropic work has always been an important part of my life too. But um, without a regular job, I could spend from usually I would spend 2 to 6 hours a day writing.
What does success mean to you?
Well, that's a really interesting question, I think. I mean, you can think about it very superficially, but that actually occupies several chapters in the last book of mine, the 72 Wisdoms book. And I actually, in different chapters, look at different ways of understanding success. But for me, ultimately, what it means is living a meaningful life. that, whatever I'm doing expresses meaningfulness, worthiness. And of course, then the question is, okay, well, what do you mean by meaningful and worthy? And that becomes even more difficult to explain. But I guess the best way I can explain it is that to have lived a life in which you did things that helped other people and you really enjoyed the life you have, then you put that together. So there's a selfish and there's an unselfish side to it. If all you do is have a good time or satisfy some need of yours, like to make money or to have status, um, then that's definitely important, but that's only half of the yin and the yang. The other side of it is having an effect that other people benefited from your life. And so that's how I look at it. And I also, there's one other sort of twist to this. I look at creating a life like creating a work of art. And so also a successful life it should be beautiful. That you can, if you feel like you have been successful, you can look at your life and say, yeah, okay, lots of things went wrong, your disappointments, failures, whatever, but all in all, I have lived a beautiful life. And but I think that comes with feeling like I've done things I really enjoy and I've had really interesting, cool experiences. But I also affected other people in a really positive way.
How do you handle criticism, if you even get
Oh, oh yeah. Yeah. I, I would say I would like to think, and I'm not sure this is absolutely true, but I would like to think the older I've gotten, the better I have gotten at handling criticism. And it really, how you handle it, and I mean, this is true of me, but I think it's true of most people, is it depends on the motive of the critic. Like if somebody, for example, if somebody criticizes a book I've written, but they're doing it in a way where I can tell that they were really thoughtful about it and they took the book seriously, but they saw flaws in it and they wanted me to know the flaws that they saw in it, then I don't find that painful. I find it interesting and helpful. But if someone is being critical and just in a mean way, that it's obviously just intended to hurt, well, you know, it can hurt. Uh, and like everybody, I have feelings. I have an ego, and when I feel like, oh, geez, and especially if they're right, uh, I mean, like, okay, so I told you, Jimbo, I was playing pickleball right before our interview started, and so say I blow a shot, I make a really dumb shot, and my partner says, what the hell is wrong with you? That was so stupid. Why did you do that? Okay, well, that's it's gonna hurt. It's gonna make me mad. It's gonna make me feel bad. But if my partner says something like, "Hey, if you would have just, you know, held your paddle, gripped your paddle a little more tightly and moved towards the ball just a step quicker, you would have made that shot." That feels completely different. Both of those are forms of criticism.
so what you're saying, well, at least what I interpret is constructive criticism is the ideal type of criticism.
Yeah. and I think if you're a mature person, you appreciate that. It benefits, and you might not agree with it, but just to know somebody else has actually cared enough to, you know, tell you, "Hey, I think you could do this better." Then, I mean, it's almost like a compliment. So, and I've coached a lot of sports, and I taught younger lawyers, and I've actually taught a class at two different universities on philanthropy, and so I've had a lot of students over the years. And when I'm at my best, I mean, that's the way I coach and teach and mentor. And I'll admit I'm a flawed human being, and sometimes I don't do that as well as I would like to. But that's definitely the approach I want to take and I try to take.
Are there any misconceptions that you may have personally received as a writer?
Um, there are some people who review books on Amazon, and for the last several books I've done, um, we have an exclusive distribution agreement with Amazon. So, that's where they're all being published and sold. And for some reason, there's some people that will write a review on Amazon or in Goodreads, and they will say, "This book needs an editor." And it's not just mine, but you often see that statement, that critique, that review. And certainly in some cases that's definitely true, but in when I've seen that, and I think I've only seen that on maybe two of my books, but it's like, okay, that person is really not serious because I have an editor, um, and if the critique would be, this book needs an editor because I found, seven different typos and five grammatical mistakes. And I said, "Oh, wow, you're right." Then, okay, my editor didn't do a very good job. Um, but when you see that statement, "This book needs an editor," it's like that is really annoying because what does that mean? Especially if the book has had an editor, which, yeah, there are definitely some books that are published, self-published on Amazon where the book didn't have an editor, and you can see that. But I've seen typos in books published by the biggest, major New York publishing companies, and it's actually very rare to read a book carefully and not find a typo or two. So, if that's the point somebody was trying to make, well, really that's rather picky and juvenile. But even worse is to say, well, this book needs an editor. So that's sort of a pet peeve I have, and because I did experience that at least twice. Um, that's one of those things that you know are annoying.
Could you possibly explain the Jeff and Alicia Rasley internship and what it's about?
Yeah, the American Civil Liberties Union is an organization that I have admired since I was very young, because it's really the one um, institution in the U.S. that has been devoted for years and years and years to representing people who have been treated unjustly under the law, and to um, being the sort of the legal warrior on social justice issues. And some of and the ACLU has taken positions on things that I did not necessarily agree with. Famous one has been back in, I think it was the 70s or 80s. They've represented Nazis several times when Nazi organizations and Ku Klux Klan organizations have been not denied permits to demonstrate. And like, okay, that, yeah, we believe in freedom of speech, freedom uh, to, express yourself, but do we really want to give Nazis and Ku Klux Klansmen permits to march and demonstrate? But anyway, but the vast majority of issues, I agree with the sides they've taken, and so I knew that our Indiana chapter, the Indiana chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, had internships uh, that were unpaid. And so they'd have law students and college students working for them as volunteers. And I have thought for a long, long time that's just wrong. I think an intern should be paid. I don't think it's right to have people working actual jobs and not getting paid. Now, if they get college credit or get law school credit for it, okay, that's different. But these were summer internships, and hooray for these kids that they were willing to do that. But so Alicia and I agreed that we would donate enough money to the organization to set up a fund that would pay the interns. So for the last 2 years now, their interns have all been paid because of the revenue that our donation has created.
So, out of your 14 books, which one is your most favorite?
My most what? My favorite?
Or the one you're most proud of?
Oh, um, I that when I'm asked that question, it's the last one. So my most recent one, because it's the one I still feel the most bonded with, the most into, and so the last one, 72 Wisdoms. But I will say another book was the most fun book to write, and the title of that book is um, Anarchist Republican Assassin, and it's a book of fiction, and it's primarily the story of a guy who, when he was young, he was an anarchist. He was in an anarchist organization that went around the country and would try to turn peaceful demonstrations into riots. And eventually he grew out of that and realized that this was really not a good thing, and went to college and uh, meets a girl. They get married, and he becomes a very successful businessman, and has this background that's hidden, that all his business associates and even his wife doesn't really know about this, because he was actually on the FBI wanted list, but has been able to change his identity enough so that he hasn't been caught. And so he lives this great life, and he's the president of the country club, and this really important member of the business community. And then his wife suddenly dies from cancer, and she dies just after he had sold the business, and they had planned this life of wonderful retirement, of traveling and doing great things and giving to charities. And then the pandemic hits. And now they didn't have any children. So he's isolated, living alone in this big mansion. And then the George Floyd murder occurs, and he's basically all he's doing at this point is watching TV, because he's kind of stuck in his house because of the lockdown, and he starts having a mental breakdown, and he basically goes crazy and thinks he's an anarchist again, even though now he's I think he was 65 years old at this point, and he goes to Washington D.C. and joins in the demonstrations against Donald Trump. And I don't know if you remember this, but there was this incident where Trump comes out of the White House carrying a Bible, and he goes and he stands in front of this church across from the White House and holds up this Bible and says what a great Christian he is. And to accomplish that, there the the military expelled the demonstrators from the street, and they used a gas and just really brutal tactics, and they beat up demonstrators. I mean, this really happened, and they beat up demonstrators. Also, Trump could walk out with his Bible and try to present himself as this wonderful Christian. Well, so my made-up character uh, decides he's going to assassinate Donald Trump, and so he sneaks around, and he's got his shotgun, and when Trump is standing there with the Bible, he aims the gun and pulls the trigger, but because he has dementia, he's forgotten to load it. And then he's tackled by an FBI agent, and he's put in prison. And then there's a sort of a young female ACLU lawyer tries to come to his rescue, um, but he's in prison, and I can't tell you what happens next because that would spoil the ending. But anyway, that was a lot of fun to write, especially the idea of somebody trying to shoot Donald Trump.
So, what genre of book suits you the best?
It just depends. I've written memoirs. I've written serious academic philosophical treatises, and I've written novels that are. I mean, one novel was a football sports comedy romance, a rom com book based on a kind of a hapless football team, and so it just I, a book just comes to me, and I've never tried to you know limit myself to one genre, which is why my wife tells me that I would sell a lot more books if I would just stick to one genre and develop a reputation, with, as like in her case, she was a historical romance writer. So she developed a following and a reputation in that. But because I write, and each book comes out in a different genre, um, I've never developed that kind of following. But I, to me, what's more important is the writing, and I'm delighted when people buy my books. Disappointed when they don't sell as well as I wished or hoped they would. Um, but it's I don't write for the money. I write for the meaning of giving to the world something that I think was important that I wanted to say.
And you've been on over 150 different radio and podcast shows. What was the goal for that?
Yeah, what I really the first time I was ever well, Yeah, so the first time I was on a radio show, really before podcasts were popular, was I was contacted, because a local, radio host of a show knew that I was a lawyer, mountain climber who had this, project over in Nepal, and he thought it would be interesting to talk to me about that and, had me on a show, and I thought, well, that's a great opportunity for the foundation because I can tell people about the what I think is the wonderful work we were doing over in Nepal, and maybe listeners would then want to donate to the foundation, and some did. So I thought, wow, that's great. And so I then, since then, with varying degrees of effort, have tried to offer myself up as a guest. Like we connected through the radiolist.com, which I think is a great service for both for podcasters and for people like me who at least think they have something to say for listeners to hear.
Radio guest.
Yeah, radio
Yeah,
guest list.com, I think it's
I
called.
use that all the time. So
Yeah,
agreed.
right.
Okay. So if you could choose any famous author to be your mentor, who would that author be?
Hmm. Um, the book that probably moved me more than any other was Marcel Proust, Remembrance of Things Past, or the alternative title is In Search of Lost Time. It's 3 volumes long of 600 pages each, so it's like 1,800 pages long. It's a huge, it's a monumental undertaking to read it, but it's so wonderful. The writing is just so beautiful and engaging. Um, I read through it, every night. I'd spend an hour reading until I worked through the whole thing. Um, but it isn't so much that the book has this great message. It's just the writing is just so beautiful that if you love beautiful writing, you'd love this book. And then it's just that, do you want to read? Do you want to spend that much time reading one book? Um, but then I really loved the classics when I was in college. Um, I took Latin, Greek, Hebrew, the ancient dead languages, and just loved reading like you know, the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Greek tragedies, um, books from the Old Testament, that kind of classical literature. In fact, I started a book club for alumni of the University of Chicago in the Indianapolis area. So we call it the Indy UC Book Club. And the books we read are what we call the books you didn't read in college that you should have. So, classic works of literature that at least somebody in the group hasn't read.
Hmm. Yeah, this is all very interesting information. So now I kind of want to backtrack here for a second. You what degree did you pursue during college?
I was in a program called General Studies in Humanities, and it was basically a triple major of religion, philosophy, and politics. So any course that I could fit under one of those three labels, I could take. So I took a broad range of all kinds of wonderful courses. Um, Law school was a drag, a real drag compared to my college experience because law school was so narrowly focused, and the method of teaching, I think, is really kind of a dumb way to teach. Where most of the classes you went to lecture every class, and the teacher would or the professor would ask students questions and basically try to embarrass the student. And then there was one final exam, no papers, no quizzes, just one final exam. That was your grade. And the way they graded the exam was just to look for keywords and phrases and count the number of times that you used the keywords and phrase. And if you got over a certain threshold, then you got an A, and below that a B, and lower C. And so it was just, uh, yeah, I was not impressed with the way law is taught.
What did you gain from that experience?
Well, what law school is very good at is it teaches you to look objectively at facts and figure out what are the important facts that relate to this issue. Take an easy one is a criminal case. So, there's been a murder. And so the police have this information, there's witnesses that have this information, and so forth. So the issue is, did this person commit the crime or not? Okay, so what facts will really help us figure that out, whether this person committed the crime or not? And so law school teaches you how to very objectively analyze what are the facts that are important, and then how to also figure out what are the issues that are important, and then finally, how do you make a decision? So, for example, you say, okay, well, murder, the real issue is, did the defendant commit the crime or not? And that's true. That is the ultimate issue. But sort of underlying that, there's all sorts of subsidiary issues. Like a witness says, "Oh, I saw him leaving the house where the crime was committed." Okay, well, is that relevant or not? Just because somebody saw him leaving the house. Okay, so then the issue, well, what time did you see him leaving the house? And so you can say, well, if it was, minutes after the coroner says the murder was committed, then yeah, that you'd say that's relevant. But if it was an hour before the murder was presumably committed, just, well, that's irrelevant. And that, that fact shouldn't be put before the jury. So law school really is good at, well, what they say is we're teaching you how to think like a lawyer, um, and it is good at that. So I'm glad I developed that skill because it served me well in practicing law. But I think it could have been taught in a more humane and actually a more rational way than it was. And I've always thought it was ridiculous to base a grade on one exam.
Okay. Now, let's kind of jump to a different experience now. You also trekked and climbed at Nepal. What was your experience like there?
Well, it was in a way, in terms of travel, adventure, um, physical challenge, it was the most wonderful and the most difficult things I've ever done. Climbing a Himalayan peak is just tremendously physically demanding. And people die doing it. Um, and assuming you don't die, uh, at some point during that experience or by the time you finish it, you're going to be very near the ultimate physical sacrifice you can endure. Um, I played American football, and people that play football will say, like, the hardest experience I've ever had was what we called summer doubles, where you go to two practices in one day, and it's really hot, and the coach is driving you and to exhaustion. And that's really hard, but it lasts a few hours. Um, a one-day mountain climb, if it's just one day, will last 12 to 14 hours. And, lots of climbs are a lot longer than one day. And you typically will spend a week to 2 weeks trekking just to get to the base camp. So you've already expended a lot of energy, um, you know, done really difficult hiking. Um, and so then to when you're already, kind of worn out to attempt this climb, but it's also, as long as long as you don't die, and you have enough energy that you can at least appreciate what's around you, it's the most spectacular scenery in the world. I mean, it's magnificently beautiful.
That sounds quite interesting. Tell me a bit more about your speaking service.
Um, you mean in terms of talks that I've given? Mm,
Yes. So
mm,
talks, whether that be in the Scientech Club or, you know, maybe even as a professor, if you've done any seminars, anything around that category.
mm. Well, I taught this class on philanthropy at Marion University and Butler University, and so every class I would give a mini lecture, and then it would be a class discussion, a seminar class, where I try to get the students to, think about the topic with probing questions and get them talking as a group about the book that we were reading and the issues that were relevant to the class that day. But the essence of those courses and many of the talks I've given um, is to promote the idea of going back to our earlier discussion about, what's a meaningful life or what's success, that every person should be philanthropic, and that's a requirement, in according to my definition of what a meaningful life is. And philanthropy, the word, comes from two Greek words, philos, which means love, and anthropos, which means humanity. So it's love of humanity. So um, that's, talks I've given and courses I've taught have been about promoting the idea that you should give at least part of your life to loving humanity.
Sure. Well, this has been a very in-depth and very interesting interview. And so, just to kind of end this off, how can readers find out more about your books and what you generally do as an author?
Yeah. I have a website, which is my full name. So it's, www.jeffrey, Jeffrey, Rasley, Rasley. I also have an author page on Amazon. So if you you just Google my name or go to Amazon and input my name or go to my website. You'll find information about all of my books and the Basa Foundation and some other interesting stuff.
Do you have any advice for aspiring authors out there?
Yeah, and I don't think this is very original, but the fundamental advice I give, and by the way, for years I've taught a memoir writing class through the Indiana Writing Center, and the sort of most basic message I try to give the students is write what you love. Find something you love and write about it. And because if you're writing, if you're forcing yourself to write about something and it feels like work, um, well, then I hope it's a job and you get paid for it. But if it's to create a work of art, to create literature, it should be an act of love.
All right. This has been an amazing interview. Do you have any final words, any other pieces of things you want to say to end this off?
Well, I want to thank you, Jimbo, for having me. It's been
My pleasure.
great talking to you, and I hope that your message and your willingness to have people like me come on your show spreads out and is a light to the whole world, and particularly to what I hope is an inspiring message of love.
Definitely. All right. Well, I'm Jimbo Paris, and this is the Jimbo Paris Show. So today we just had Mr. Rasley. He was an excellent guest, and we're just going to end this off with a few quick shout outs. The first shout out is going to be our affiliate partner, LifeWork Systems. They essentially do a lot of different things, but they're basically an HR superstar company. They go into large corporate businesses and they essentially improve their HR infrastructure, their employee infrastructure, and allow for a better collegial environment in a business. The next person we have, the next thing we have is our YouTube channel. It's up there on the upper right corner. Subscribe now, ring that bell. We are slowly growing in subscribers, and we would love to have more people so that they can enjoy great content like this. The next thing I would like to discuss is going to be down to the left. This is our Roku channel. We have currently been publishing episodes now for the last 2 years on Roku TV. This great episode will also be on Roku TV, so check that out there when you get the message. Final thing is Jimbo Paris Services. We also are a drop servicing business and a marketing agency. We can make social media accounts for you. We can make content for you. We can automate your social media accounts and profiles so you won't have to ever touch it or work with it. I'll be managing it. And we could also do the same thing for podcasts as well. And it's at a cheap price of only $249 for one account per set per user, and also cheap price of $400 for podcast. This is probably a pretty low price considering most will cost about $2,000. Again, we're out here to help people and make it easier for a lot of you small business owners to automate your businesses so you can focus on what's important. All right. And again, thank you again, Mr. Rasley. Thank you again, everyone, for watching the show. I'm Jimbo Paris. This is the Jimbo Paris Show. Thank you for listening to the Jimbo Paris Show.